You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Ottoman Butt. What is Ottoman science? How do people mark time in the early modern period? And what knowledge were people across the Mediterranean interested in before the Enlightenment? Our MEMO conversation today, we are taking a historical deep dive into these topics. Joining me to help make sense of all of this is Maryam Patton. Maryam Patton is a PhD candidate in the Joint History and Middle East Studies program at Harvard University. She focuses on the late medieval and early modern period and is especially interested in cross-cultural transmission across the Mediterranean, especially in the field of book history and the history of science. Her dissertation examines the historical understanding of time and the temporality in the Ottoman Empire from approximately 1330 to 1600. She received her MPhil in European history from the University of Oxford, where she was a Ertugun scholar. That's a very Turkish word. She graduated summa cum laude from Princeton University, where she majored in history with a minor in Arabic. She is also a frequent host and editor of the Ottoman History podcast. Maryam, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And apologies to any Turk who I've just insulted. So let's go right to the beginning. So what I mean, you've mentioned in your bio you obviously did an undergrad in Arabic or minored in Arabic. You then eventually did Ottoman studies. So what drew you to this entire field of Middle East? Let's start off with Middle East first, and then move to Ottoman.
Sure. So I didn't actually formally study any Ottoman history until I started my PhD, but I'd always had an interest in it kind of tangentially in my broader historical concerns. But full disclosure, my mother is from Turkey. So growing up, I spent my summers in Turkey and was sort of kind of aware of the history, but not in any sort of serious sense. But I do remember growing up in the US and going to high school in the US and sort of learning about European history and the Renaissance and all that, just encountering lots of references to Turks. And I always thought that was amusing and never understood why, especially like in literature. I remember in English class reading Shakespeare and there'd be these references to Turks this, Turks that. And I never really understood why until I got to university and learned the broader context of sort of the early modern period and Ottoman history and their engagements with the Europeans. So my interests kind of started there. I studied Arabic out of personal interest, and that definitely shaped the way I approached historical work, because at university, being able to read the primary sources of the area that you're studying was, I realized, a major part of sort of being a historian. And so my sort of formal historical education definitely began in university. And I focused on the early modern period more generally, but was developing an interest in, as you described it, cross-cultural encounters. What that means is sort of, examples of books or ideas or objects or commodities sort of crossing cultural, what we would traditionally think of as like a cultural boundary, be it, Europe, Ottoman, Islam, Christianity, and sort of exploring what those boundaries looked like, whether they were real. And the more I study, the more I realize how unsatisfying our traditional kind of boundaries and divisions of the world really are, especially for this period of sort of very increased movement and trade across boundaries. So that's sort of how I got started. That's where the interest kind of came. Like, one, my personal background, my mother being Turkish, growing up speaking Turkish, and then realizing that what you're taught in high school isn't the full picture of Europe versus the Ottomans. So I then just explored further in that way. And here I am now, like 10 years later, still doing this. And it continues to be a source of intrigue and, surprising discoveries all the time. It's a very rich field, I think. And more people, more and more scholars are signing on to this idea that maybe Europe wasn't this super finite, defined area of the world that we think it is, the way we think of it today, perhaps. So that's how I got into Middle Eastern history, Ottoman history more generally, and more specifically about like the history of science. That traces back to my undergraduate experience. So I mentioned studying European history, but with an interest in sort of the Middle East and my background in Arabic. I wrote my senior thesis about the first Ottoman references to Copernicus, this manuscript that we have from the mid-17th century, and sort of read it, tried to understand why this Ottoman scholar had translated a French book of ephemerides and what that meant about the broader kind of social context of science and the spread of knowledge in that part of the world. And that's sort of where I've continued ever since. I think history of science is a very interesting lens with which to sort of explore this idea of culture, because there's nothing about a scientific idea that's necessarily specific to a culture or an ethnicity or a race or anything like that, right? It's like today we think of science as like a universal truth. So if it's universal, it should be able to transcend any kind of geographical or political boundary. So I think that's why history of science in particular is an angle I've pursued, trying to explore what it means for ideas to spread.
Interesting thing to think about, because it feels to me as if, like you growing up, when you thought about the Mediterranean, if you just said the word Mediterranean, it would only refer to the Western Mediterranean, to Italy, Spain, maybe Greece, but the Turkey and other places were just not classed as part of that.
Yeah.
And it's only as you sort of get older and you get into studying it, you realize Eastern Mediterranean is just as much the Mediterranean as the West, and the histories between the two are intertwined. And it gets more complex when you think about the different groups that live there. I mean, if you think about Turks, for example, you're obviously they're very much Mediterranean people because they live next to the Mediterranean. They have very similar diets and stuff that you'll find across the Mediterranean, but they also are people that have ties to Central Asia, which brings in history from other parts of the world. And so Mediterranean is a very it's a very cosmopolitan, it's cosmopolitan, and you've got people connects to other parts of the world as well. It's one of the reasons why it's so interesting. But I don't know. I mean, I can see in academia people acknowledge this, but I'm not sure whether it seeps out enough or not.
I definitely think that it's not as publicly acknowledged outside of sort of the university setting, this idea of like a Mediterranean world that's sort of very cross-cultural and diverse and comprised of very many different societies, as you said. But you're right, it's not a new idea. Like, even though I suggested more and more scholars are sort of signing up to it. One of the more influential books I read as an undergraduate was Brodell's Mediterranean, or at least selections of it. And he says quite clearly in his preface to the English translation, I think from 1972, that the Christian Mediterranean breathed the same spirit as the Turkish Mediterranean. And we are uncovering more and more information to reveal that by studying more of the sources, especially in the Ottoman archives. So there is still, like, even though this idea was presented, Brodell's Mediterranean 50 years ago now, or actually older, it was like in the 40s when it first came out. It's not fully caught on yet. And I think a lot of that has to do with just sort of modern politics and modern sort of ways of viewing the world and sort of the way Western history is presented. But it's certainly not a new idea. And the real question, the more interesting question, is how people then thought of themselves, like not so much how we think of the division of peoples and societies then, but how people living in the early modern Mediterranean viewed whether they belong to a broader Mediterranean sort of world. It's hard to answer that question because it comes down to the sources. But that's what I'm more interested in, is like how people viewed themselves in the time period. But
I feel like we're going to come to that. It's definitely something worth exploring, how people self-identify, because of course identity as we understand it today has shifted over time, and how people thought about their identity and what constituted it has shifted a lot since the early modern period. So it's really a big fertile area. I mean, your part of your identity might have included where you went to study, as part, not just as a place you went to, but as a part of your origins as well. What teacher you had was part of your origin as well. So it's a very, fertile area. But we were saying as well about the idea of science being universal, but it's an interesting one because on the one hand it's universal, but on the other hand it's also seen as culturally exclusive, in the sense that it's one culture that finally broke through and did it all, i.e. Europe, who had, because you had the scientific revolution and stuff in the 17th century, it is the Europeans who have mastered it. And if you just do whatever the Europeans did on every level, maybe you'll be as successful at science. And science is the ultimate thing that's held up. So there's this sort of double binary, especially with the history, where on the one hand it's universal, but on the other hand it's triumphalist for one culture over others.
That's certainly the modern kind of view of science. This idea that sort of scientific advancement is what grants a part of the world kind of authority or superiority. That is actually a fairly recent way of viewing the world, and a sometimes pernicious one, because it leads to sort of very Whiggish history, sort of teleological, like, okay, well, if we know the correct answer is this theorem, then we're only going to look at what led us to get to this endpoint, rather than all the sort of contingent and multivaried forms of science that were also pursued, like at the same time as whatever sort of correct theory you're uncovering. And that's what makes it very difficult to do history of science. History of science is, and I think it's fair to say in most universities, at least in the US, not a separate department. It's often within history, but it is at Harvard, for example, it is a history of science department. In fact, it was founded by George Sarton as the first example. And so one always wonders, like, why is history of science a specific, like, is it any different from doing any kind of history, right? Trying to avoid anachronism. And it's hard precisely because of the social value we assign to science today in 2023. Like, science is, truth. And that's, it's difficult to set aside those views to try and understand science at the time and how it was viewed then and what was considered science. And this is where things like astrology and alchemy get interesting, because we think of them as like, nonsense, like magic and fake. And they were very serious. Occult science was just science. It wasn't sort of a separate scientific thing in the early modern period. So I completely agree that today we kind of have these views about science that associated with sort of why did the scientific revolution happen in Europe and not elsewhere. But asking questions that way is, historians try to avoid those questions precisely because it leads to only one answer. And so I try to, it's hard. It's really hard. That's sort of, it showcases what we think about science today more than anything, I think.
It is hard because it's also the question a lot of people want answered as well. Yeah. So, I mean, the book that came out, you were involved in translating and editing, I believe, which was, what was the title again? Sorry, of that.
The Ottoman Scientific Heritage.
Right, because he does talk in the book, the person you're translating, he actually does go into what he sort of suggests an idea for what might have happened here, because he does, for example, look at scientific books being published in Turkish, Ottoman Turkish, and Arabic and other languages. In fact, it's kind of an interesting study because he was looking at multiple languages, and he does notice there is a decline in the number being published over time, sort of towards, I think, the 18th century. And he sort of suggests a kind of model which is taken from the Chinese experience, where in China, for example, up until the 1600s, let's say, I'm not an expert on China, sorry, if we thought about science in East Asia, we'd think of China automatically, because it is the place that has a long built-in tradition of science. We wouldn't think of Japan, but Japan from the 1600s, 1700s adopts the modern form of science from, similar to what's happening in the West. And he sort of suggests that here it's because Japan has no specific tradition to draw upon, in a sense, and so it can just fully adopt. And he thinks this is analogous to Ottoman Empire, because Russia, again, compared to Russia, which doesn't have a tradition to draw upon, it sort of can adopt wholesale this new type of science, whereas the Ottomans struggled because they already have a tradition.
Yes, no, it's so Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu is the author you're referring to, and yes, and that's the final chapter of volume 1, which is kind of presented as not case studies but comparisons between, as you mentioned, Russia, China, Japan, and the Ottomans. And it's a very interesting argument. Unfortunately, as a scholar, like I edited and translated that text, but I focus on the early modern period, so I can't speak too authoritatively about what happens in the 18th century and beyond. But it is interesting to sort of compare this issue of scientific traditions, like prior traditions, and whether they inhibit or in any way help sort of, skipping prior traditions in order to sort of get up to speed to the modern tradition. It's a very interesting question. And the Ottomans, as you mentioned, are an interesting case for this because they are also connected to an Eastern, sort of Central Asian tradition that has its own influence, and sort of where they fit in this broader world schema of East or West or neither is an interesting one to ask.
Yeah. So, but I think the question I could throw at you then is, what do you think the interest in this topic and what he wrote about here, what do you think that tells us about what we're interested in as people who read this kind of history? What do you think it says that we're so interested in this?
I think it says a lot about the association between state and society and science. We today have our identities really caught up with national identity, for good or bad, and so explaining historical developments in those terms in the form of sort of state institutions that either sanctioned or promoted certain things. That says a lot about sort of how we view ourselves today, I think. And not to suggest that you didn't have institutional science in the early modern period. You did. You had madrasas, you had official roles that scientific scholars were appointed to, that were all paid for by the state, and thus they were bureaucrats in a sense. Those are not new concepts. But the idea that there's some sort of stake in it, like your nation reached this point or that point. As someone who grew up between two different countries, I've always been very wary of sort of being too tied to any one kind of context, because I don't know, I grew up in a diverse setting, so I resist those kinds of characterizations. But it is a reality of the world we live in today, unfortunately.
Yes.
Maybe it's not unfortunate, I don't, but
yeah, I can sort of see why it might be, because it can lead to a lot of very bad, even racist takes on, why things like this happen. So that's definitely the part there, what you're saying. But one of the reasons why I had to have you on, though, is when I saw the word time being used, because this is a very interesting concept. I mean, we'll get into this now. But because you write about, the fact that if we were to sort of travel, even, obviously this is true across the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, but even if we were just to walk across Istanbul or Constantinople in early modern period, Ottoman period, we'd be coming across different communities that are interacting with each other, that are overlap each other in every way, but who are experiencing time slightly differently, because they have slightly different calendars and so on. So could you perhaps talk to us about this dynamic?
Yeah, absolutely. So people's experience of time is very different from person to person, of course, and that's true today as well. But I think today we lose sight of the fact that things have become extremely universalized. So, for example, time zones, all of us agreeing that the time is the time it is, and it's not tied to our specific longitude, but a wide sort of an arbitrary geographic distinction. The fact that we almost universally across the world use the same calendar, the Gregorian calendar. And these things are very recent developments, extremely recent, like last 100 years, 150 years. And when you let go of that realization that actually things are far more varied historically, you then just start asking questions, well, what else was different about the way we conceived time? And so in my dissertation, which it covers a lot of different layers, and that was the best way I could understand to sort of address this question, mainly because there really isn't any work yet on Ottoman conceptions of time for the pre-modern world. There are a few books out on sort of the 18th and 19th centuries, or sorry, 19th and 20th centuries. And they're caught up with sort of the history of Ottoman modernization and westernization and how that relates to sort of timekeeping technologies. And they're very good books, but there wasn't a work that kind of explored this for a time period when we didn't have rather semi-accurate clocks, or for that matter, electrical lighting, which alters the way people organize their day. So that's how I got interested in this. Well, I was already interested in the period, but then I realized, this question hasn't been answered before. So I start with just looking at the geography of the Mediterranean more generally, partly because the other sort of major distinction between time for us today and time in the early modern period is that we're no longer so spatially bound or geographically affected by time. By that, I mean, for example, the seasons, right? Like we, for the most part, regulate our lives the same way in winter as we do in summer, other than like some activities that we can do in summer that we couldn't do in winter. We've kind of conquered space a little bit in a way that wasn't true for the early modern period. And this is also true when it comes to the speed of travel, which is a major reason why time zones were invented in the first place, is because rail travel was fast enough now that you would travel backwards in time effectively. And so time zones were sort of created to help synchronize that. So the fact that we today don't have to worry about these problems, I think means what I'm trying to showcase in my research is that they had effects on the way people viewed the world historically. So that's what I'm trying to explore in the early modern period and the Ottoman case in particular. And what I found is that there's a huge variety of aspects of life that are affected by time in a way that we don't worry about anymore. So I mentioned seasons, but consider, for example, seasonality as it relates to what foods you're able to eat. Today, thanks to globalization, I don't know if you think it's a good thing or not, we can eat fruits and vegetables that are normally not in season where we live because they're in season somewhere else, or we can have them brought like the southern and northern hemisphere, the switch in the seasons there. That wasn't true historically. And I find it really amusing when, let's say, you go to a fancy restaurant and they advertise, oh, we only serve seasonal ingredients. Historically, that was your only option. It's only in the modern period that we can eat out of season. So that's an example of how, a kind of small detail that you wouldn't necessarily think about because we take for granted, like, oh yeah, I can have apples any time of the year, right? But what you ate and drank was seasonally bound because of the way the climates worked around the world. And I mentioned briefly electric lighting. There were oftentimes strict regulations about what times you could have candles lit in the early modern period for fears of fires and sort of errant candles burning down wooden homes, especially in Istanbul, where wooden homes were the norm. So, imagine a life where, winter now, when it gets dark at 4 or 5 p.m., your social life is over. There's no such thing as nightlife, right, in this period. So the social architecture of the day is very different when you don't have things like modern electrical lighting. The days of the week you would perform certain actions. Today, almost universally, we kind of accept this Monday to Friday work rhythm. But even that's not necessarily true. Like in parts, I lived in Jordan for a little while, and Friday, Saturday was the weekend, Sunday was the first day of the week. So these things that you still see little traces of these kinds of temporal irregularities between different parts of the world. So just think of that just times 1,000, basically, is sort of what I think my research draws out. And in Istanbul in particular, what made the Ottomans, I think, really interesting in this period is the variety of calendars that they used. It's often suggested that they predominantly relied on the Islamic Hijri calendar, which is a lunar calendar, and strictly lunar calendar, which makes it a bit unusual, rather than lunisolar. And what I've found is the Islamic Hijri calendar was just one of many that the Ottomans relied upon. And one of the reasons that they had additional calendars were because a lunar calendar, for example, isn't so useful for agriculture, because plants and animals don't really care about what phase the moon is in, right? They follow the seasons, which is dictated by the sun's position or the Earth's position relative to the sun. So they had to have a solar calendar as well to help sort of regulate calculating things like taxes. And all these kinds of variables just combine to create a really, I think, temporally vibrant kind of world. Not to suggest that because they didn't have timekeeping devices the way we do, their view of time wasn't any less, accurate. I don't like to use the term accuracy or sort of precision to suggest any kind of temporal superiority, because their way of calculating time for them was mathematically advanced and scientifically sound, and it suited their purpose then, which is different than our purpose today, where we're driven by industrial capitalism and have to worry about like things down to the second, and computers that sort of operate very precisely. So yeah, in my work, I try to explore just all these various layers of life in the early modern period in Istanbul to showcase the variety of time, of temporal experiences, and the importance of seasonality, and the commingling of cultures and different religious communities who had their own holy days that were celebrated according to their calendars. We have so many accounts of travelers from this era, like European travelers coming to Istanbul and saying like, oh, like while these people are like, the Muslims are celebrating this and the Armenians are celebrating this holiday just like 2 streets over, and it's all just sort of this temporal mingling. And I'm trying to just sort of illustrate that as vibrantly as I can in my research. So yeah.
A quick question about the calendars. Did they sort of draw anything from their Central Asian origins in terms of calendars?
Yeah, great question. So the Turks or the Ottomans, that's an interesting distinction. They're like Turks versus Ottomans, that's, we can maybe address that another time. The Turks that eventually became the Ottomans sort of were part of a broader Turkic migration from Central Asia into Anatolia, what's today like the peninsula that's most of Turkey, modern Turkey. And there were at least 2 other calendars I would suggest as an answer to that illustrate this pre-Islamic, pre-Mediterranean calendar. And the first is the Turkic calendar. It's called Hayvan Takvimi in Turkish. And it's very similar to the Chinese zodiac, the idea of each year there being a symbolic animal that sort of designates that month, or that year rather. And the origin story is also very similar. The idea is that it's narrated in the Kashgarlı Mahmud's Divan-ı Lügat Türki, this like dictionary of Turkish language from the, I want to say 13th century, perhaps 12th century. And he tells a story about one day a ruler wanted to recount the tale of a battle, but didn't have the date distinguished. So he was confused about like when it happened. And so he then invented this calendar, and they went on a hunt and drove sort of 12 animals across a river. And the order in which the animals crossed the river dictated sort of what order they came in the year. So it's a cute story, very similar to the Chinese zodiac story. So that calendar persists in my research, at least until the 19th century. I find examples of horoscopes that are calculated according to the animal calendar. And the fact that it's an animal calendar, to me, sort of speaks again to this broader kind of view of time being natural, and sort of animal migration patterns being very important to understanding the seasons, especially when you consider the sort of nomadic origins of the Turks and sort of the need to pasture their animals sort of seasonally. So the animal calendar is one, and the other is the Celali calendar, which they inherit from the Selçuk Empire before them. And this calendar was devised as a kind of astrological calendar, basically to sort of create a sort of more precise way of reckoning the year. But then it took on the name of Jalaluddin Malik Shah. So like that's why it's called Jalali. So it's kind of like a calendar invented to sort of glorify Jalali, but it doesn't appear super often in Ottoman sources, but it appears all the time in the astrological context, the scientific context. So that's another interesting example of having a calendar for a really sort of specific purpose, like calculating horoscopes, even though they had all these other calendars available and there was nothing precluding, using any of the others. So those are the two that come from the sort of Central Asian tradition, and that illustrates the sort of geographic variety and political kind of influences of broader things than just Islam.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you were speaking, I was smiling to myself because I was thinking about 12 years ago when I was over at Exeter University, they would have these chronicles, which are Safavid chronicles from Iran, and I'd read them, and then these chroniclers who were writing in like the courts of Shah Abbas and so on, these are Iranian chroniclers, they would put they'd have the Hijra year, and then next to it they put the year of the dragon, the year of the. I was thinking that's kind of a funny thing, and it's kind of true what you're saying about the naturalistic origins. I mean, that's true for the alphabet as well, because a lot of letters are connected. The original letters, if you go Phoenician, Greek alphabet, and this sort of thing, and even in ancient Egypt with hieroglyphs connected to animals. So there's always been this sort of sense that there has to be a connection to something natural. Which I think is a very interesting thing to explore. But it's also interesting because, of course, one of the reasons why I thought time was an interesting thing to explore is that time is something that we've seen in, say, the Turkish literature tradition has come up, as a theme. I mean, there was a novel called The Timekeepers Institute, which I think is really famous. And it's an interesting, because essentially it's about the idea that, a modern European idea of time can be imposed on a country, and you follow this civil servant as his job is to make sure all the clocks are correct, because if it's like a second out, it will, infect the minds of the Turks and they won't be modern enough.
Exactly. Yeah, these sorts of time is a super, a human element. It's embedded in our lives. We can't escape it. We know our time is limited, and so the value we give it says a lot about who we are as a society. And but yeah, no, Orhan Pamuk's novel. Not Orhan Pamuk.
He's influenced by him though.
I'm blanking on the name now, but we can put in the notes.
Put in there. I was trying to think of it too, and I couldn't remember. But yeah, it's
that's the Turkish name.
Yeah. It's funny because it's also a big area in the Middle East, because, people forget, obviously this is true of other regions as well, but this whole idea of this kind of time was sort of imposed in a way. You saw this in the novel, but if you think about Iran as a good example of this, if you know their 20th century history, like they essentially reformed the Hijra calendar in 1905, I think, 1906, to make it a solar Hijra calendar. So they switched from lunar to solar, but kept the Hijra. And then the Shah in 1975 or 1976 got rid of the calendar he was using and imposed what he called the Persian calendar. And so Iranians went to bed like one night in 1975 and woke up in the year 3000 or something. So time is constantly being played around with in modern states.
Absolutely. I mean, it was only a week and a half ago, right? Daylight savings, the clock's adjusted. Yeah. It's just like we just decide, okay, it's an hour earlier than it was. But
this is also important because when we think about time, we talk about, well, what's your basis for, let's say you want to say how long an hour is, right? What are you basing that on? Because the fact is, it used to be the idea that it's to do with solar movements on the sky. But the sun is never in the sky for exactly 60 minutes. It's like anywhere between 50 to 72, I think. Depending on the time of year you're in, it varies. And so these are averaged out.
So this is what's referred to as a seasonal hour, this idea that an hour isn't sort of an equal duration throughout the year. That's, again, a modern development, partly technologically driven. So like when the first clocks were invented, clocks started appearing in the 13th and 14th century. And as they became more sophisticated, they sort of expanded further. And sort of by the end of the 16th century and early 17th century, you get clocks pretty similar to the kinds of clocks we use today with springs and pendula. But before then, hours were measured seasonally, at least in the Mediterranean world, where there was, some variation because of the latitude between an hour in winter and an hour in summer. So 70 minutes in the summer, roughly, and 40 minutes in winter. So a day was understood as 12 hours, no matter what time the sun set. So you had 12 hours of daylight, 12 hours of nighttime throughout the year, and thus the measure of an hour varied based on the season. This is what the Ottomans relied on until they eventually switched over, or mechanical clocks and accurate clocks became sort of more dominant, I want to say in the 17th, 18th centuries. But what's interesting is that in the 16th century, they were very interested in European clocks as objects. And so a large community of clock makers actually established itself in Istanbul to make these clocks and to sell these clocks and design these clocks. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's father was actually one of the official palace clock repairmen, and there's a plaque in his honor in Galata today. But the Ottomans didn't adopt clock towers the way Europeans did. And this appears a lot in the diaries of travelers saying, how come, they don't have clock towers? What time is it? We don't know. Except there was a massive trade in actual clocks, like the ones that you have on a table, but they were objects of beauty and sort of gifts as opposed to sort of practical devices for telling the time. So there's this very interesting sort of disconnect between the object as the device for time telling versus the kind of time understanding that was prevalent then. And it gets to this point exactly with the Timekeeping Institute. Sort of, what makes you modern? Is it that you can tell time accurately or that you have this sort of technology? It's, fascinating questions. And there's like so many examples of this that I could sort of get into. Yeah.
It just, as you're speaking, it reminds me of what they call the broken clock tower of Sarajevo, which is another example where they've done it, where they have to adjust the minutes every day because of difference in sunlight. But we need to move on to astrology, which is another interesting area because, we have this idea, of course, that astrology is something that's now coming back, but did it ever really leave? But the Ottomans was for the Ottomans, astrology was very important. So how did their interest in it manifest both at the state level and society level?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I will preface this by saying that the Ottoman interest in astrology was just part of a broader sort of early modern interest. Like, it wasn't just the Ottomans. Renaissance scholars were also deeply entrenched in studying astrology. Some of the biggest names in sort of the idea of modern science developing in the West, like Kepler, Tycho Brahe, all these figures, they were interested in astrology as well. But at the same time, you also had a lot of people criticizing it. So it's really hard to say, like, was it, accepted full stop, or was there always just like a tension? Basically, you can always find someone criticizing astrology at the same time as someone endorsing it. So it's really hard to say. But yeah, I think the Ottoman interest in astrology is just part of this broader tradition going back to the ancient Greeks of a belief that the world is organized according to a pattern and intelligent sort of deliberate design, and studying the movements of the planets, if done accurately or well, can reveal knowledge about the world. And the debates in the Ottoman context about whether astrology is allowed or not often came down to this distinction between, are you studying the planets and where they are because you believe they cause events on Earth, or is it because you believe they will foretell what's going to happen in a kind of revelatory sense, right? Like, you're just sort of reading what's written versus sort of saying it's being caused by the planet. So that's sort of like where the debates over the distinction between astronomy and astrology often came down in the Ottoman context, at least in the early modern period. But yeah, I think it's the prevalence of astrology just speaks to a broader kind of view of the world and nature, that seeks to understand the connections between us on Earth and the broader cosmos. And it's a very ancient idea that persisted well after the period that I studied. And really, as you questioned, has it really gone away? I don't know. Like, people seem really into horoscopes today as well. And the way it manifested in a lot of different ways. Much like in the European tradition, the Ottomans had official astrologers. And in fact, one of the sort of more senior roles in the Ottoman bureaucracy, or a senior role, was that of the chief astronomer or chief astrologer, depending on how you want to translate it. He was called the Müneccimbaşı. And this was an office that was created in the mid-15th century, so rather early in the history of the Ottoman Empire and the state. And one of the Müneccimbaşı's chief tasks was every year on Nevruz, which is the spring equinox and the start of the year according to the Central Asian Persian tradition, and the start of the solar year. Every year on Nevruz, the Müneccimbaşı would present his almanac, his takvim, to the Sultan. And this contained not just the tables predicting the positions for the year, but also foretellings about his fortunes and sort of what he could expect. And so that was one of his sort of yearly tasks. And the chief astrologer would also be consulted about things such as when to engage, when to begin a campaign, when to have a certain celebration. Various cities throughout sort of medieval Islamic history in particular have been sort of predicted in terms of groundbreaking based off the astrologers' sort of predicted times. And so it was a similar case in the Ottoman world, with sort of predicting when to go on campaign. And over the years, various sultans kind of shied away from it. Every sultan has his personal preference about whether he gave any credit to astrology. But the office of the chief astronomer persisted throughout the rest of the history of the Ottoman Empire. It was only ended in the 20th century with the end of the Ottoman Empire. So it's, there was always someone on the books for hundreds of years getting paid to make horoscopes, which I think is very interesting. So that's just one example of how it manifested at the highest level at the Ottoman court, really. And within society more generally, the best evidence I can suggest are manuals that are written, I think, in a very kind of plain, easy to understand way that suggests they were more for popular audiences as opposed to sort of very learned scholars. There's obviously tons of learned literature on astrology. And in fact, the text you mentioned earlier, the Ottoman Scientific Heritage, one of the sort of volumes that it stemmed from, this 18-volume series, is just on astrological literature and sort of goes through all the various manuscripts in the Istanbul libraries that we know of. And it shows that there's a very rich literature, but those are all quite learned texts. In order to find sort of the kinds of things that regular people would be reading who didn't necessarily have a madrasa education, you have to look up things like almanacs that are called melhemes. They gave you kind of predictions based off of what kind of natural signs you could see in the year, and gave you predictions for how the weather would go or how the rest of the year would perform. And you had literature like saatnames, books of hours, that told you like, when's the best time to get married or get a haircut or go to the market. And accounts of travelers like Stefan Gerlach, who's this German Lutheran theologian from the late 16th century, who wrote this really extensive diary of his life in Istanbul. There's a really fascinating passage in his diary where he says, the Turks have this thing called like a book of hours, and every day they step out and they consult this book before they carry on with their task for the day to figure out when is the auspicious time to perform it. So these sort of references here and there and the existence of popular literature suggests that it wasn't just sort of the Sultan who was interested. And you have other little signs, things like talismans or calculations and margins of texts that all speak to a kind of much broader interest than just state officials. And I think that's true of their contemporaries in Europe as well. So it's not surprising to me that it's a broader concern. People are just interested in living the best life they can, and if they can get some extra knowledge about how to do that in the future, more power to them. Better safe than sorry, basically, is sort of, I think, how we can understand the prevalent sort of belief in astrology.
Yeah, it does strike me as there must be also, to my mind, something kind of intuitive about that kind of approach. I mean, you're trying, the future is completely uncertain, even the near future is uncertain, and so you're trying to find any means possible and necessary to figure out how to do things so that you can get the best possible results, and so you use whatever you can. I mean, it's really funny to me when I look at modern Turkey, and a friend was telling me that you had because a lot of people, because of the currency crisis, are investing in cryptocurrencies and things like that. They have astrologers on YouTube and Turkish who are doing predictions for the Bitcoin market and cryptocurrency market. So it's still something that happens there.
No, that's true. The impulse to sort of understand one's future has never gone away. And, we readily acknowledge that the position of the sun and the moon affects things on Earth, right? When it comes to tides and seasons. So is it so far-fetched to think that the other planets also affect events on Earth?
Well, we do. I mean, a large part of why we are so, enamored with modern science is that it is about trying to predict the future. That's one of the reasons it's so attractive to us. So we've just transferred where we go for that. But I sort of want to move forward to, knowledge in the Mediterranean, because as we've sort of said throughout this piece, there's a view, obviously, we've mentioned previously, that the Ottomans and European powers are characterized solely through conflict. And that's obviously become under question in scholarship. And obviously there's studies done on trade and stuff. But beyond sort of trade, obviously people are moving around because you've got traders moving around. But when it comes to sort of knowledge and books and intellectual production, what was passing between these places, the empires passing between European Mediterranean to the Ottomans and vice versa? What were people interested in? What was being passed around?
No, it's a great question. Unfortunately, it's one that we still are only just scratching the surface. I think that's sort of what I would suggest. But what's exciting is that more and more discoveries are being made every day, basically, as more manuscripts that, aren't necessarily a titled work, but rather just like a random notebook or a kind of text that wouldn't necessarily have garnered the attention of a scholar before. Nowadays, we're encountering more and more texts and saying, oh, actually, this reveals like this marginal comment on this text suggests this scholar was visiting from Venice and traded this book for this book. Things like that are being found every day and will continue to be. So I don't think we have a sort of very clear idea just yet of what, like, the full extent of what kind of knowledge and books and ideas were being transmitted. But what we do know is that there is a lot more than meets the eye. And sort of just to start off as an example, I got interested in the history of science through this manuscript about Copernicus from the 17th century. And one of the arguments I made in that work was that if you read the translation, the Ottoman translation of this French text and sort of the preface that the author gives, it's obvious that he's not encountering this text for the first time or discussing the content in there as if it's brand new. So it suggests that there was something going on before, or at least more awareness than we can garner from this one manuscript, but we don't have the material evidence quite yet. Maybe it'll turn up one day, in a manuscript. That's one of the sort of benefits of the kind of work in that book that I translated, is that it's pulling out like lists of what manuscripts exist in libraries that in a way that wasn't questioned before. So astronomy is definitely one of the bigger concerns, and the link between Copernicus and the Ottoman world, or the Islamic world more generally, is extremely hot and juicy because everyone wants to, because of how the conversation we started off with, where we associated science today with sort of advancement and superiority. Heliocentrism is kind of touted as like, oh, that's the like turning point. Like once Europe sort of figured out that it wasn't the Earth going around the sun going around the Earth, but the other way around, that was sort of the beginning of of the modern sort of scientific era. Because of that, the question of did Copernicus get his ideas from the Islamic tradition is like a super hot button topic right now. And there's like all kinds of just weird tangential suggestions like, yeah, there probably was some sort of exchange between the Islamic world via Istanbul and Venice, and thus through Venice to Padua, where Copernicus was studying. So Robert Morrison is a scholar who's sort of written about this Jewish scholar, Moses Jalinos. And that, before I get into that, let me just preface by saying, after the fall of Granada and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, a lot of them went to the Ottoman Empire. And there, then you have this influence of sort of the Spanish, Iberian medical tradition transporting itself all the way to Istanbul. And that is this new source of sort of intellectual exchange and transfer. And so, yeah, Robert Morrison's research suggests that you had figures like Moses Jalinos who did travel to Venice in the late 15th century and talked with Venetian scholars there and vice versa. And so astronomy, astronomical theories was a big source of interest. John Graves, who is an English astronomer in the 17th century who traveled to Cairo and to Istanbul, he claims in one of his books on calendars, like, oh, when I was in Istanbul, I was talking to people and they said that their head astronomer studied in Rome. So there's all these like references there. Guillaume Postel, a French Orientalist scholar, was very interested in sort of Central Asian traditions. He had works by Nasruddin Tusi, who's obviously hugely important for the Ottoman scientific tradition. And I think earlier I mentioned the clocks, the Ottoman interest in clocks, and sort of the one of the biggest names in Ottoman science, Taqiyuddin al-Rasid, Taqiyuddin the astronomer. He writes a treatise about mechanical clocks in the 1570s, and he says that he studied the collection of clocks that his patron had, like the actual devices. So there's so many of these kinds of offhanded references or examples of books that were traded that speaks to a much broader, much more vibrant culture of trade that we're just really scratching the surface on. And books is a big thing, like, books ending up in Turkish libraries and vice versa. There's a lot of scholarship already about sort of European interest in Arabic texts and Ottoman texts to a lesser degree. And the other direction, I think we're discovering more and more as these books show up, and it's like, wait, what's this random Italian book doing in this Ottoman library from, the 17th century? But definitely astronomy was a huge interest. And partly because of its connections to astrology and sort of advanced calendars, but at least for the 16th century, that was a big source of intrigue, or at least concern between them. And that's just one example. Like, because I study astronomy and astrology, that's where a lot of my examples come from. But if you expand the picture to art, literature, textiles, commodities, coffee, John Graves's sort of co-companion and co-traveler was a scholar named Edward Pocock, who I wrote my master's thesis about. And he basically wrote about coffee in England, in Oxford, and because he lived in Istanbul for a while, or at least in Syria, and sort of brought awareness of coffee to England. So it's not just ideas and commodities, but just broader interest in, fascination with the way the world works, really, in the form of astrological and astronomical texts. So yeah, those are just a few examples I can think of off the top of my head. And who knows, as I said, it all comes down to the sources in the texts, and as more and more manuscripts and books are read and studied, I think we'll encounter even more and more examples of these kinds of exchanges.
Just quickly before we get to the very last question, because you mentioned, obviously you had people like Spanish Jews coming in and bringing in the sort of Andalusian, tradition of science. Is that what happened with Ibn Rushd? Because Ibn Rushd, there's this argument by medievalists that Ibn Rushd was just not influential in the Arab world when he was around. He sort of died, he wrote this book, in defense of philosophy and this sort of thing. And it was just not influential at all. He came too late for that entire argument. And there's this idea then that it was sort of revived or kept alive in Europe. But somebody pointed out to me that, in fact, in the Ottoman Empire, his works did enjoy much more. It was widely read and argued about in ways that it wasn't in the medieval Arab world. I'm just wondering if that's what happened there. Maybe when the Spaniards came over, they brought it with them.
That sounds right. I wouldn't be able to say definitively.
Okay.
I'm not super versed in the Iberian tradition. Muhammad Balin, I think, would be the one to ask. He's sort of really well versed in sort of the medieval Andalusian tradition. But it makes sense. It makes sense, I think. And yeah, what Ibn Rushd's role in the broader Ottoman intellectual climate, it's an interesting one because it then ties into Ottoman awareness of the medieval Arab tradition and where they informed. Because there's debates about whether, you know, when it comes like geography, example, and cartography, whether Ottomans actually sort of knew all of the works of the medieval Arab geographers. There's a lot of debates in that field. So I can imagine it's a similar thing with Ibn Rushd and with medicine in particular. But I couldn't say specifically whether it's related to the expulsion of the Jews. But it would make sense. Yeah.
Okay, I just wondered about that. So last question then. So what are you sort of pursuing and working on now, and what do you hope to do?
I am hoping to finish my dissertation. That's sort of what I'm doing full time right now. And with any luck, inshallah, I'll defend in April or May. But I do have ideas for my next project, sort of like as a postdoc. And I am interested in the rise of Neoplatonic philosophy and Platonism in the Ottoman intellectual context. Again, because I think there's something there about the broader sort of early modern world of the rise of the sort of persisting interest in Plato and Platonic thought. And I think there's an interesting angle there that we can pursue where Renaissance scholars who were interested in Arabic sources in order to sort of get at the true Plato or the earliest sources they could, had to go via the Ottomans. So I think there's an interesting history there about, you know, was Platonic philosophy prevalent in the Ottoman case, and were Renaissance scholars communicating with Ottoman theorists at the time? That's sort of where I'm hoping to go next, but I'm just in the very beginning phases of it, so it may not shake out, but that's what I'm hoping to write about.
When you said you're inshallah there, was that an American inshallah or a Turkish / Middle Eastern one?
Both. Yeah.
Because just for the audience benefit, when they say inshallah in the Middle East, what they really mean is it will have to only be through God's will that it comes about, because I intend to do absolutely nothing about it.
Yeah. No, I definitely have to put in the words on the page now, so I hope it works. But yeah, that's what I'm doing right now. I'm just.
It's always interesting when that word gets used, because you never know whether they mean they're going to do it or not.
Oh yeah, no, I will do it. But you know, who knows what'll happen? Yeah. So.
Maryam Patton, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
No, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your questions and for having me on.
And to our audience, thank you. If you would like to catch up with this one or watch previous MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website. But please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.